Hey, welcome back to another episode of Detection at Scale. Today, I'm here with Roger Allen, who is the global head of detection and response at Sprinklr. Hello, Roger. How are you doing?
How you doing, Jack? Glad to be here.
Good to see you again. We briefly caught up the other day, and I'm really excited to get into the show today. So, one of the things that you gave me a sense about was your background coming into detection and response, and I'd love for you to just start with how you got into the defensive side and what your journey was until this point.
Yeah, so my background started as a early, what I'll call closet hacker, hacking video games and things along those lines, war dialing to get more time on the internet. And through my career, I decided that I wanted to use the skill sets that I had for good and made the transition to offensive operations, penetration testing, eventually red teaming. And then I was at the point where I was looking for more money, and I kind of had the observation that people will pay you more money to protect their environment than they will to break their environment. So it inspired a career change, and I made a transition to security engineering, focused on automation and building defensive solutions. And around that journey, the culmination of my experience from the offensive mindset and then my understanding of data analysis, data engineering, kind of just paved the way for me to move into detection response and understanding at scale, how are we going to prevent attackers from engaging our environment? And how does that relate to the data we have available? And it was just kind of a perfect fit.
So, thinking about the offensive side, how do you think that made you a better defender?
So understanding the attacker's mindset, I think, is really critical. And whenever you're a defender, it's really good to understand like the data and the analytics of it. What are the defensive mechanisms we have in place? But understanding your adversary, I think, is one of the most critical aspects to, stopping attackers in their tracks, understanding what are they looking for? How are they targeting an organization? What are their exploitation techniques? Threat intelligence really becomes, I think, really important for, especially someone with experience in red team, understanding like who are our adversaries? How can I specify their TTPs and use those to my advantage to know what we're looking for? How are we going to try and shut them down or mitigate some of their capabilities? Just the understanding that attack path analysis, I think, is really, really critical for a defender to be really effective in understanding who their adversary is and then kind of trying to be one step ahead of them.
Do you actively use any of those adversary tools today in defense? Because I think we talk a lot about writing rules in SIM typically, but I don't hear us talking a lot about, and I'm speaking of like the community of us, talking a lot about like adversary testing, but it's such an important part. So are you actively using tools today, doing emulation, like making sure that your controls from like the actual security controls to the monitoring controls are all like working well?
So it's definitely something we're increasing. So my team is come up with a really complex methodology for how we're, onboarding new alerts in our detection engineering process. How are we validating those rules? How often are we validating those rules? I think that's another critical thing that a lot of organizations don't do is, once they start a rule, they'll fire it and then they'll just kind of let it go. And, 2 years down the line, it hasn't fired. Is it not firing because you're not seeing that activity? Is it not firing because it's broken and it's no longer valid, or, what the case is? So my team has come up with a really great framework. We're in the process of enacting that into our organization, our process, and then have an annual cadence review or biannual cadence review based on what we're seeing firing or what we're not seeing firing. But yes, we are going to be validating those rules and following emulation practices so that we can validate they are returning and firing on the instance they should be.
So the mindset is more atomic. It's like we have a set of rules that test for certain vectors, and we want to make sure that they're periodically reliable through some case. How are you doing that? Is it more integration focused, unit test focused? I mean, maybe this is a good transition to talk a little bit about the methodology that you practice with detection engineering.
Yeah. So right now, I've got a small team. We're growing. We're building. It's very manual focused. However, my team is very heavily automation minded. The goal is to get automation capabilities to be able to validate these on a ongoing basis. But until we have that automated capability, it's manual. I think there's going to be a lot that we can learn from the manual phase testing. And then we do have, red team and penetration testing operations that come through on a frequent basis that will coordinate with them kind of more on a purple team assessment phase to validate some of these, higher risk rules or some of the rules that maybe aren't as effective from an automation testing, or even seeing, maybe we've written the rule where it captures a portion of the attack vector, but not an entire portion. So obviously, we'll select a set of rules and make sure that we're validating them and seeing someone else's perspective on them.
Have you seen or heard anyone using LLMs for doing adversary testing? Because it feels like a really interesting opportunity. If you think about like the way that an LLM would think about injecting randomness into the process, kind of like chaos engineering, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I've actually put a lot of thought into this, and one of the things that I think there's definitely a place for that to kind of enter into the domain, but I think it has to be very thoughtful. One of the things about doing this that I've really been concerned about is if you turn an LLM loose and it starts if it starts engaging your environment, what's the threshold that you give it to terminate the attempt? How far is it going to go? Is it going to start shutting down some critical systems or something? So it's got to be very measured. But I do think there's a space for that. And I think someone will probably make lots of money once they figure that out.
I was even just referring to like synthetic like events and stuff. I wasn't referring to actually making API calls, but that's actually with a lot of the advancements with functions could be really fascinating, especially if you apply it towards cloud APIs. So you could create a
Yeah.
set of like LM functions that say like, okay, well, this is the set of things that you would run to exfil from a bucket. It's cool. That's a really cool
Yeah.
idea.
No, and you look at there's a lot of vendors out there that do like, automated, testing different platforms in ways. And there's some value to that. And I think that if you're just testing rule sets and if you're an organization that has a full scale red team and you can run, red team operations throughout the year, there might be value in that just kind of as a check the box. Is the rule still working as intended? Do we see the alert fire? Okay, we can deconflict. Yep, we're good. But from an organizational perspective, if you don't have a dedicated red team that you can do, your actual testing with, I think there's a lot of value in that manual phase. So you're gaining those insights and you're able to take those lessons. So without having a red team capability, kind of gives you that simulated capability to gather additional information and be able to capitalize that back into your program.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, it's nice that you have access to red teams because it just brings so much specialty and organizational and tech stack context into the discussion. So the reliability of those tests is probably pretty good. How do you think about just starting from scratch when it comes to writing rules, right? It's like, how do you prioritize the things that are important to you in your environment?
So I think the most important thing to understand, like, how do you prioritize? And I think this kind of leads into like where the paradigm shift has gone from SOCs where they are now and where they were 10 years ago. But, when you're looking at what are you prioritizing for the rules in your environment, you have to really understand like what is most important that we protect? Is the objective to keep everybody out, or is the objective to set boundaries and thresholds and detect any activity that crosses over those boundaries and thresholds, and where those boundaries and thresholds should be? For large organizations, are there multiple boundaries? How do you prioritize those boundaries across each other? I think that's kind of where the maturity has gone from keep everybody out to, okay, well, even if they get in, kind of more of the defense and depth kind of strategy. What are the points in time that this is more concerning, or what are the sequence of events that are more concerning? Where I think historically, 10 years ago, we were looking at how many alerts can we fire? How big can my SOC be to manage this volume of alerts? Where I think nowadays with the advancements in technology, I think we can say just because this alert fired is not the end of the world. And we've kind of moved on from looking at just an alert fired to what is the sequence of events that we need to understand. That's what we're more looking for to enact incident response versus just, hey, someone just hit our edge with Burp Suite. Okay, it's going to happen. Where, hey, someone hit our edge with Burp Suite, and then we saw that IP address make this additional API call, and then they, that sequence, that's more concerning to me as opposed to just, hey, there's an API call.
Yeah, I think that's a really important call out. I mean, so if we go a little bit deeper into that, so sequences are more reliable because it's looking across the kill chain. What's the mindset in creating these? So if we go a little deeper, and we combine what's most important to your environment, like how do you think about creating sets of correlations? And I'll just call them correlations, right? Because I think that's probably the most accurate, generalized way to describe them. but like how does this shift play out over time? Like how do you build this library of correlations?
Part of it goes into how do we look at, again, the adversary mindset, and then, from our offensive security operation mindset, you're always looking at the kill chain, right? You know that you're going to gain initial access, you're going to pivot, you're going to establish persistence, there's key steps you're going to walk through. And as we kind of go through our operations, we see either a activity that we've investigated and we've seen kind of a attack path, and we'll build scenarios off of that. B, our simulated events, we'll understand like how was the attack carried out. We'll build scenarios off of that, and then we'll also riff off those, right? So my guys that have the offensive mindset, they can see deviations of like, oh, hey, they use this as like the initial entry technique, but they got persistence this way. But you could also get persistence X, Y, and Z because we have that internal knowledge of our platform. So we'll expand our correlations to that capability.
That's super interesting. I mean, there's been a big push towards this area, which is great for the reasons that you specified, right? It's like someone just scanning you is not important, and we should stop looking at it. And it takes more of a intentionality towards what's important. As a security team, like how do you get close to what's important for the business? Because there's a natural understanding that has to occur here between knowing the tech stack of the business and then understanding the purpose of the business and how they interact with the world, whether it's like B2C, B2B. So how have you seen security teams bridge that gap to get more smart on what's important to the business?
So that's one of the things that I think sold myself on as I moved into the current role that I'm in was, I consider myself a builder of bridges and a breaker of walls. And I made a point to go out to the business, have conversations with the business, and have a meaningful conversation with them on what's important to them. When you look at security, I think one of the fallacies that most organizations have in security is we just impose security requirements, right? It's like, oh, you have to have 600 character passwords that have, all these different conditions and requirements, and have repeating characters and all these things. And making sure we're having conversations with the business and finding that balance, I think, is critical. And that's one of the things that I've really been a champion of at my organization is building those partnerships with the engineering teams and the product teams and the customer facing teams, and finding ways to, instead of just enforcing and throwing requirements on them, finding ways to help them understand the importance and the value of security to them, and then listening to them to understand the importance of where we're causing too much friction, and then finding that middle ground that everyone can say, hey, at the end of the day, we all came out with a win.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, the why is so important, both in understanding the perspective of the engineering team and understanding the perspective of the security team. And on the context of like business requirements and things like that, cost is such a huge thing these days with how the market has adjusted in the last few years. So I want to talk a little bit about that for a second. When you think about your logging and data strategy as a detection team, like what are the parameters that you're operating within? How do you decide where you want to invest in terms of scale? Like meaning like how much you can spend on data and what are the levers that you're pulling to maintain those costs?
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge that we've been navigating, right? So one of my major prioritizing factors was, how is data available? So if we have a data set that is, disparate, it's not available to us through other means, then obviously that becomes a top priority for us. We need that access to that data. Whereas if there's another data source where it's available, it's just not in the ideal means, we'll reduce the prioritization on that. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is, how do we bring in and correlate that data strategy to what's the value of it's going to bring to our team? So if we have a log source that says, hey, we can't do this enrichment that's critical for, all these different scenarios that we're trying to build out, then that's going to be higher prioritized versus just having a bunch of data and not having a usage of it. So there's been a lot of strategic decisions that, and I won't even say I made them. I really lean on my leadership to inform me on what's important to them. So, what's important to the incident response team, what's important to the threat intelligence team, what's important to, my vulnerability management team, and then even my engineering team. And then understanding, having them work together and say, hey, you guys need to kind of come up with an algorithm on weighting how important is this to each of you, and then what's the level of effort for us to get this data set in, and then kind of computing how do we prioritize these data sets, and then what's their utilization or usage as soon as we get them in. So that's one of the things I've been really, with the Snowflake model, really honing on my team is we don't want to just bring data in to bring data in. We need to bring data in to be utilized. And then the other aspect we've been really looking at is how much of this data is focused on proactive security measures versus reactive security measures. So is this going to increase our or decrease our investigation time? Yes, there's a value to that. But if I can prevent issues from happening from proactive security measures, then we'll also decrease our investigation requirements or the number of investigations we have to do. So there's a balance between that as well.
Are you often working with like data teams in your company? So you mentioned Snowflake, and Snowflake in these data warehouses typically are owned by data teams. Is it commingled, or is it just for security?
We have multiple instances of Snowflake. The security team has their own instance of Snowflake, and I've got members of my security engineering team manage our individual Snowflake, manage our own pipelines, and then we have different partners that will use some of the data that we brought in, just because we've done a really good job at kind of orchestrating how we're bringing data set in. We had a really strong data strategy as we started kind of building out our Snowflake and our data lake. So we actually have started partnering and sharing some of that access with our engineering teams, but it's definitely been very helpful to have my own team dedicated to these efforts and making sure that we had all the controls necessary for the way that we need to utilize Snowflake.
That's super interesting. And then, in the past, we talked a lot about, just as an industry, like hot versus cold with data storage, and cloud data warehouses made it so you could effectively store everything in hot because of the separation of storage and compute. But I still feel like that's not fully put to bed, right? Like the hot versus cold. So is that a strategy that you're using at all, where you say, okay, well, to use your prior example about proactive versus reactive, it's like VPC flow logs is a good example. It's not really good for proactive security because it's not rich and it's not high fidelity enough to get a sense of what's happening, but it's really good for response. So how do you think about log sets like that? Are you still putting it into the data warehouse because it's the easiest thing to do and it's like cheap enough? Or are you thinking about a strategy where you're saying, okay, well, I'll leave it at an S3 until I need it, and then I'll pull it in?
So the SOC platform that we have does a really good job at doing cross-analysis correlation, and the value of having different data sets in for what we'll call insightful enrichment and insightful correlation. There's value to us having that data availability. So if we see an IP address, like, hey, it hits us every 3 months, right? We can actually start building some of those patterns and algorithms, and actually will build a detection for us that kind of sees that, which has been really kind of interesting. It's actually had some good insight for us. So I do think there's value in having kind of the data set the way that we're doing it, where it's all hot, it's all available, and then understanding impact. I do think there's a big value to that if your organization can afford it.
Yeah, because when you were talking about data utilization and things like that, one of the places my mind went to was being able to say, okay, these particular logs we're never really going to utilize, but we need them for compliance. We need them for like a large scale response. So, and this is a similar thing that I was talking to Josh about from Brex, where he was talking a lot about like the routing and transformations layer being like a stream and being able to like tag and route things. So just been thinking about that concept a lot.
When you put it just in the context of like the incident response and then the SOC kind of, I mean, if you separate those functions or if you have them consolidated in that aspect, I think that, you're looking more relevant to like 30, 90 days context. But when you look at it from like a threat hunting perspective, you want to see every iteration of a particular potential IP address, or every iteration of a unique user string, or every iteration of, and I think that will give you more insight. So I think that if you take a single lens and you say just incident response or SOC operations, maybe there's more value to having like bucketed approaches. But when you look at threat intelligence and you're looking wide scale and you're casting big nets to try and catch, potentially big fish, I think the more data you have availability, the more cross-functional impacts that you can pull in, I think the better effect you'll get from a return.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because with threat hunting, you're looking for clues. That makes sense.
And every little clue and connection you can bring together will paint a bigger and better picture for you.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about like the high level SOC. So what are you looking at as a leader to gauge the health of the program?
Obviously, number one is growth. Are we continue to grow and scale our detections? What is the response rate? What is the volume? One of the things I'm most cognizant about as a leader is my team, right? So how do I make sure my team's avoiding burnout? How do we ensure that everyone's being, amply rotated through, functions, or are they being amply rotated in time off? Or are we seeing that our trend has been, 11-hour days versus an 8-hour day? I always try to make sure that we're capacity planning so that no one's working more than 8 hours a day. I think that's one key aspect is how am I taking care of my guys or gals? I think the other aspect is, from a growth perspective, how are we scaling our growth? Do we see our detections scaling? What is the, fidelity of our detections? Do we see our false positive rate increasing or decreasing? There's a lot of different ways. We actually have a really neat Power BI dashboard I can maybe show you sometime on how we're starting to track a bunch of this stuff.
On that topic, how are you doing like alerting today? So, I mean, a big part of that feedback loop of fidelity is response from the team. So, how do you make sure that that data is always captured?
So that's a really big part of the framework I told you the team has kind of come up with and is in the process of rolling out. So false positive are going to start being tracked based on the detection. And then, it's going to be compared to the true positive rate. And obviously, if we have something that's got a certain threshold of false positives, then that's going to be a key indicator to cycle it for us to say, hey, this needs tuning. This isn't firing at a high enough fidelity rate. And then we'll analyze, is it a data quality issue? Is it is the rule written and not refined appropriately? Is it, whatever the case may be, we'll walk through kind of all those stages, but we actually have indicators that we're starting to track that will tell us, hey, this rules is, doesn't have high enough fidelity.
How is the team interacting with alerts? Is it through like a ticketing system? Is it a messaging system?
Yep.
Is it the SOC platform itself? Like, what's the avenue to like in the response cycle to say, yes, it's this, and then they sort of put the feedback into the system?
We use Ambilogic for our SOC platform, and then everything fires into Times. And then Times does some additional magic on it, we'll call it, because it really is. And then it fires into Jira. And one of the reasons we use Jira specifically is, and one of the challenges I found with a lot of the ticketing systems is you just don't have enough granular control to define the fields that you want. Usually it's like, hey, select from these 15 fields, but we wanted to start doing things kind of differently. So all of our tickets connect or link to an alert ticket for what the actual alert content is. Whenever an alert's created, we actually have a ticket showing the alerts created. And any false positives will actually be linked to that, and true positives linked to that. And then we can pull metrics and reporting on that. And based on that, that's how we're going to start making determinations on, is this high fidelity? Is this low fidelity? And that's what's also we'll use as a driver for, hey, is this going to be set? What's the review cycle for this? And when's the next review coming up?
That's awesome. I love that. Oh man, we talked about a lot today. This was really good. I'm just going through my notes, and I feel like I learned a lot from this conversation. So I think to round out the conversation, how about what are your 3 pieces of advice for running a modern SOC and for folks who might be starting today?
Yeah, number one, I would say so much of defensive operations is data. Make sure, number one, you hired a good data guy. Number two, make sure that you've got a good data strategy. Make sure you analyze and set, proper formatting with your logs. Work with your engineering team to get them into standard logging formats. And then part of that data strategy will say, go downstream, make sure you understand how are you going to use this data from enrichment perspectives. How is this going to be utilized, and what formats do you need this to be able to push us into automated functions and automated response, or take additional actions and have the right fields there. So, and then number 3, I'll say is, make sure that the team is on board with what your vision is. So at the end of the day, it's great for, senior leaders to have a vision, but you can't just push your vision on folks. Make sure that they have adequate input. I always say that, a good idea can come from anyone, anywhere, at any time. So make sure you're listening to, the people that you're managing. At the end of the day, my philosophy is, they don't work for me, I work for them. So
We call that servant leadership. That's
it works well. It works well.
That's awesome. I really respect those. And I really loved the call out on burnout. And think the more that we can talk about those things and mental health and just sustainability of high stress work environments, I think it's super important just in general.
I always try to, when people ask me what I do for a living, I tell them I'm the firefighter, police, and EMS of the cyber world. We have all the stress without the perks and danger.
That's true. And I think remote work actually makes it a lot easier to burn yourself out because you don't really have a boundary as much.
Exactly. It's so easy to go into an 11, 12-hour day, 14-hour day, 16-hour day. You get in the midst of an instant and just by the time you turn around, you've been up 20 hours, 22 hours. And you're like, oh, wow, where'd the day go?
It's crazy. All right, Roger, it's great to chat with you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And if folks want to learn more, I mean, are you guys hiring? Like, if you need to plug anything, this is the time.
Yeah, hoping to hire by the end of the year. We're hoping to get some headcount. So keep an eye out, Sprinklr.com and careers. And yeah, obviously, thank you. Obviously, we've got a lot of great partners and I really appreciate everyone that we work with. So thank you all that if you're watching, know that you're part of our success.
Awesome. Thanks, Roger.
See you, Jeff. Cheers.